What's interesting about the G20 at Las Cabas is the G20 is stuck between being a crisis committee and a steering committee. Mexico is the host. President Calderon wanted the G20 to move into the steering component, putting much more attention on sort of long-term, ambitious initiatives, green growth particularly, but financial inclusion, even things like disaster management with a lot of buy-in from Japan and of course Mexico itself with a history of earthquakes. What is interesting though is, like in previous G20s, is that it's got back into the crisis mode. Greece all the time, the first day, the euro crisis, certainly the problems of integration in Europe. We can get into the sort of negative of this, but it was probably the positive, is that there doesn't seem to be any backlash to the actual countries around the table anymore. There seems to be legitimacy, that the countries that we have involved in the G20 are the right ones, whether they come from Europe, whether they come from the BRICS, and indeed whether they come from these sort of floating countries that have a great deal of diplomatic credibility and prowess, but aren't sort of linked into a formal structure. What is going to be the difficulty, of course, is getting real deliveries beyond just having the G20 as a focal group, having a group that really brings all of these issues to one site, that has a variety of the right sort of countries involved, but whether there will actually be progress. We can see some degree of progress, as has been mentioned, in terms of IMF activity, certainly the new resources that have been offered, particularly by BRICS countries, but also by a number of other countries, Japan and other countries as well. So certainly this is important. The BRICS, of course, are wanting to have a quid pro quo on this, and this is really going to be the difficulty, to come into some real sense of instrumental reform for the IMF. It's promised in early 2013, but we've seen promises before. The other sort of real movement is on banking union, and I think here we're going to see the Germans moving from this sort of defensive position, feeling through the Chancellor Merkel, being sort of cornered and having to sort of put all sorts of problems onto their backs, coming out and being a bit more offensive now, having some sort of initiatives, pushing back and really putting a lot of pressure on other European countries, including France, the former sort of main partner with Germany in terms of the EU on so many of the G20 initiatives, but really putting pressure on them to come to terms on the big issues like sovereignty, but also on the technical questions about whether the ECB is going to be the focal point for reforms, whether there's actually going to be real technical progress in terms of mutualization of risk. And I think these are going to be the real issues in takeaway from Las Cabas. We can see, just to finish up, the change in who is really being targeted at the G20. When we started in 2008, it was the United States, the epicenter of the international crisis, under the gun, having to come up with the actual G20 as an international institution. The Chinese under pressure in subsequent G20s in terms of imbalances and currency issues. Now we see the Europeans coming under. And we can see from yesterday, particularly at the press conference with the President of the Commission and the Presidents of the Council, how sensitive they feel about this sort of pressure. Europe is used to being the model, the democracies coming together, the like-minded countries, the countries that have an enormous amount of soft power. Now they're being targeted for their deficiencies, their defects in governance, not from their strengths. And again, this is going to be an interesting development to see how they're going to respond over time to this. But once more, we come back to the positive, that the G20 itself certainly is the legitimate body now for all of these issues, for all of the fragmentation. All of these are going to be in one spot each year, and we're certainly seeing, in that regard, the G20 having a privileged position.